What's good, YouTube? This is Who Is Like God, back for another one. And we're going to be talking about how the New Testament actually never contradicts the Torah. So while it's Super Bowl Sunday going on, you know what I'm saying, right now, I'm going to catch the highlights later. We're talking about some way more important stuff right now. Something that I play can be a blessing for both the body of Christ and outside the body of Christ. People to actually consider the idea of Jesus being the Messiah from a legitimate perspective, because a lot of what they've been told about Jesus or the New Testament, that it contradicts the Torah or goes against the Torah, when you actually break it down piece by piece in the Old Testament and the New Testament, we see how perfectly it connects. And we're actually going to be looking at ancient Israelite examples to help us better understand the ministry of Jesus, to see that consistency. So we're starting the conversation with Simon the Just. For those of you who have been people in my community tab, this is the Simon the Just video that I've been promising. Now, numero uno, Simon the Just is not in the Old Testament. He was the high priest of Israel basically between the Old Testament and before the time of Jesus. So we're dealing with one of Israel's high priests after the Old Testament period, but before Christ. He's actually mentioned in the book of Sirach in chapter 50, verses 1 through 5. Greatest of his family, the glory of his people, was Simeon the priest, son of Johanan, in whose time the house of God was renovated, and whose days the temple was reinforced. In his time also the retaining wall was built with powerful turrets for the temple precincts. In his time the reservoir was dug, a pool as vast as the sea. He protected the people against brigands and strengthened the city against the enemy. How splendid what he was as he looked out from the tent, as he came from behind the veil. So Simon the Just, highly remembered among the Israelite diaspora. But here's the thing. There's a debate if Simon the Just is a Simon the First or Simon the Second. I'll put the list of Israelite high priests on the screen so y'all can see the debate concerning Simon the First or Simon the Second. Because it seems that Josephus, who was a contemporary of the apostles, a Jewish historian, thought that Simon the Just was Simon the First, but it seems like Ben Sirach, according to most scholars, seems to think Simon the Just is actually Simon the Second. Either way, whichever Simon or Simeon it may be, we have an established tradition by Jesus' time that there was a really righteous high priest of the righteous lineage by the name of Simeon. That's number one, because we're going to be talking about this character later. Here's numero dos. I don't normally make videos about the law because there's verses in the New Testament that tell us not to quarrel about the law and to respect other people's opinions concerning the law and the practice of various commandments or mitzvot in their own lives, such as Romans 15 or the passage in Timothy. All right. But when we actually begin to study these things, we see how consistent, when we look at everything the Old Testament says and doesn't say, and everything the New Testament says and doesn't say, we see how consistent the whole picture is. You see what I'm saying? So from that type of historical, studious, ecumenical perspective, I'm actually making this video and actually talking about the law to see how consistent these things actually are. Because a lot of people say things without realizing that what they're proclaiming is actually a misrepresentation of the truth. So this ancient Jewish perspective of Simon the Just and how he operated within the law, the Torah, actually yields to that perspective. The nuances of these things, which show how the New Testament and Christ's message is actually totally consistent with what people have done and practiced before them. All right, so to peep this, we're actually going to have to look in the Talmud. Now, I do not hold to the Talmud as an authoritative source, and I normally don't appeal to the Talmud, but we see that it preserved traditions that the children of Israel had around 200 to 220 Common Era, or 200 and 220 AD, because this time frame is when the Mishnah was codified. And the Mishnah is basically a collection of Jewish laws and things by a man named Judah HaNasi. So the Mishnah is basically a collection of these various laws and traditions of the children of Israel by that point, and the Gemara is a commentary of those things. But various traditions that were not preserved in the Mishnah are known as Baraitas or Beretas, which are oral traditions outside of the Mishnah. So if the Mishnah was composed about 200 to 200 in the Common Era, if we're talking about a Bereta, we're talking about an oral tradition that was known at that time, would have been known at that time, that was not reflected in the Mishnah. So from that perspective, we're talking about traditions that go back to, that were recognized in roughly the 200s AD among the children of Israel about Simon the Just, who was before Christ. So from that perspective, I think these traditions are probably reliable in that they're preserving what was believed to have been said by Simeon the Just in his ministry as high priest. And it gives us insight into perspective from ancient Israel into how the nuances onto how the law, the Torah, should be properly understood. Even if this tradition doesn't go back to Simon's lips, it gives us a very foundational point about the law of Moses that was recognized by later rabbis. So we can still look at this and see this is a very foundational concept about the law that most of us miss, that was even recognized by early rabbis. So when we can bring ourselves to understand this concept about the law, which we'll get to, then we can better understand Jesus' ministry and see the consistency between that apostolic message and everything among the Torah and the prophets before Christ. Now, I will say, I do think these traditions are reliable, most probably, about Simon the Just and the Bereta that's reflected in the Gemara about what Simon the Just did. But what I will say, just for a point of direct comparison, is I think the New Testament has much more reliable traditions, because you see the old traditions about Jesus would have been codified and written down in what we now have as the New Testament before the first century ended. So just by point of comparison, I think this goes to show the level of reliability we have in the New Testament with how quick things were actually written down beyond just oral preaching, and even the creeds that we can get from the New Testament that actually show us the earliest proclamations of faith by the messianic community in Jerusalem, the first people to believe in Jesus ever. The type of stuff they believed is preserved in the New Testament, which we can prove and many scholars will get into, but that's a little bit of an aside. All right, reading from the tradition in Nedarim 9b5. All right, we talked about the Bereta, this oral tradition not reflected in the Mishnah about Simon the Just. Let's break it down. Now we're getting into the story, because Simon the Just, this ancient priest, gives us transformative understanding about the Torah that totally helps us in this conversation and will help us see that the New Testament never contradicts the Torah. All right, so as it is taught in a Bereta that Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik said, basically it's taught that Rabbi Simon the Just said the following: in all my days as a priest, I never ate the guilt offering of a ritually impure Nazarite except for one occasion. One time, a particular man who was a Nazarite came from the south, and I saw that he had beautiful eyes and was good looking, and the fringes of his hair were arranged in curls. I said to him, "My son, what did you see that made you decide to destroy this beautiful hair of yours by becoming a Nazarite? A Nazarite must shave off his hair at the completion of his term. If he becomes impure before the completion of his term, he shaves off his hair and starts the term of his Nazariteship again. I was a shepherd for my father in my city, and I went to draw water from the spring, and I looked at my reflection in the water, and my evil inclination quickly overcame me and sought to expel me from the world. I said to myself, 'Wicked one, why do you pride yourself in a world that is not yours? Why are you proud of someone who will eventually be food in the grave for worms and maggots? I swear by the temple service that I shall shave you for the sake of heaven.'" Shimon HaTzadik continues the narrative. I immediately arose and kissed him on his head. I said to him, "My son, may there be more who take vows of Nazariteship like you among the Jewish people." And that's alternatively translated as, Simon the Just kissed the Nazarite on the head and said to him, "May there be many like you in Israel." So as the tradition goes, Simon the Just, this high priest who was a real person before the time of Christ, was approached by a Nazarite. And for anyone who doesn't know, a Nazarite is a specific vow in the Old Testament where you basically renounce drinking, renounce wine, renounce alcohol, and renounce shaving as a sign of dedication to God. So you're renouncing all these pleasures, and you're basically letting everything grow, and you're not shaving it off as a sign of dedication to God, right? And at the end of that term, then you shave everything off. So that's the vow, that's the deal. So Simon the Just is approached by someone who has taken this vow, and he's like, "This is the only time I actually honored the guilt offering of a ritually impure Nazarite, was when this boy came to me. Because when this youth came to him, he was so touched by his reason for wanting to become a Nazarite that it basically left an impression on him." So basically, we have this Israelite youth. We don't know what tribe he's from. It just says that he's from the south. He comes to the high priest, and he has beautiful flowing curls in his hair. And basically, what happened is he looks in the water. He looks at himself in the reflection of the water, and he's like, "Yo, I'm a good-looking kid. I'm a good-looking dude." But then he realized, "Yo, how wicked am I? This world does not belong to me. My hair does not belong to me. I'm going to die like everybody else, and I'm going to be food for worms and maggots. How wicked am I to get all puffed up and prideful over my own appearance when I'm gonna die like everyone else? So it's from that moment that this youth decides, I'm gonna take this vow so I could cut all my hair off, I could cut all my mane off, so that I won't get puffed up and prideful over my own appearance. So as the story goes, he approaches Simon. Simon is so touched that this is the one time he actually honors the Nazirite vow of a ritually impure Nazirite. And is actually says, I wish more people like you among the children of Israel took this vow with the right heart and mind. Now, for the messianic community, the global messianic community, let me pause and take this time to reflect the words of Christ, or Yeshua HaMashiach, when he said, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. This is a lesson I so sincerely want to proclaim, is that we need to be humble. We need to be humble, because having confidence in yourself is a great thing, but we have to be careful not to be unbalanced. And I think that that's some very pervasive in the culture we live in, which is very self-exalting. And we gotta be careful. We gotta humble ourselves, y'all. Especially, so I'm gonna say it flat out: if you a good-looking person, humble yourself. Don't get arrogant. Don't get puffed up, because you're gonna die just like everyone else. Could be naturally, your soul just could be required of you, and you could go peacefully. Whatever happens, you're gonna die like everybody else. So what right do you have to be puffed up based on your own appearance? You should be grateful to God for what he's given you, and leave it at that. You feel what I'm saying? What I'm saying is, I really respect the attitude of the spiritual and physical forefathers that came before us, and how they connect to the words of the Messiah. We should have such an attitude of humility that we don't get puffed up on our own appearance, which is also a sign of maturity. So let me say this: there's nothing wrong with being good looking or wanting to look good, as long as you know your place in the universe. Feel me? If you know your place in the universe, I think all of this is reconcilable. So that's a practical point, an application point for the followers of Christ in the body. But here's what I want to say. You know what I'm saying? Here's a theological point that I want to make. Simon, or Simeon, did not like when people took the Nazirite vow. This story, as it is told, as it is related among the Jewish community, is the only time where he actually honored the offering of a ritually impure Nazirite. It's the only time in his 40-year ministry as high priest, because he was so touched with this boy's reasoning for wanting to do the Nazirite vow and wanting to shave his hair. Right? So we see not only is this the only time that he did it, but after he does it, he says, I wish more people did it with the right heart. We did it with the right intention like you did. Which means that in his eyes, as high priest, most people did not take the Nazirite vow with the right intentions in his day. So what now? What does this mean? As reflected by the early rabbinic community, does this mean that the high priest of Israel disliked the Torah command, or rather how it was carried out in his day? Let's break it down. Here is the main point. Here is the concept that I wanted to get, the main point of the whole video. How we can know the New Testament never contradicts the Torah by a point many often miss. A concept indirectly being recognized by early rabbis. The Torah, with all its 613 commands, was a nuanced system. Not all commands apply to everyone. For example, as a man, you could go your entire life without having any certain commands ever applying to you, because certain commands were for women and apply to menstruation and things of that nature, all right? So there's certain commands that apply to certain groups. Furthermore, some commands were conditional commandments based on a voluntary choice. So that's the main thing right there. That is the main point right there. A concept that's indirectly being recognized. Some Torah commands were conditional commandments. Conditional commandments based on a voluntary choice of you choosing to do something. Here is the procedure set out by the Most High. But you could go your whole life without choosing to do that very thing. The Nazirite vow, or vows in general, are a great example of that. You could go your whole life hypothetically without ever taking a Nazirite vow. But if you chose to take that vow, here are the procedures written and left behind by the Most High, so that you don't break the terms of that vow. And that wouldn't be a violation of the law by any means. What that would mean is simply a conscious choice you would be making within the bounds of orthodoxy that God had set. You could choose to do certain things, and here are the commandments if you do. But you could go your whole life without making the choice. Again, several Torah commandments are totally conditional. The foundational point about the law that's being recognized and that I want to proclaim is that it's not this strict rulebook of 613 commandments that every single Israelite, male and female, are accountable to at all times, at all moments. Rather, what you have is a system of moral laws, judicial law, economic laws, and even priestly laws, things that naturally apply to certain functions within society. Now, moral laws obviously are applicable to everybody, not only because we could see the patriarchs held to the same standard before the law of Moses was ever given to the Israelites in Egypt after they escaped. Not only can we see that, but even on the other side, if you accept the New Testament, moral things that everyone is accountable to, more moral precepts of the law. So not only could we see that based on within this testimony what is universal, but beyond the universal things that God wants to see among his people are laws and regulations speaking of different functions within that society. Obviously, the priestly laws wouldn't apply to anyone else but priests and to the Levites, yet they're still there for that function and for that group in society. So beyond all the nuances of a system that dealt with the judicial system and the legal system and economic system and priestly system of an ancient country, we have things that are totally conditional as well. This wasn't a strict rule book in that sense. It was a nuanced system for an entire country. And beyond that, we have laws based on voluntary choices that you could choose to make. So bring this nuance to the New Testament conversation. One of the charges brought against Jesus and the New Testament is that they teach against or contradict the Torah. On the contrary, Jesus actually begins his Sermon on the Mount by saying this. Matthew 5:17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. That last verse is going to be important later, but here's what I want to say right now. We see from Christ's opening words in his teaching is that he ultimately upholds the law until heaven and earth pass away, upholds the authority of the law and the scriptures, while also seeing himself as the catalyst by which these things will be fulfilled. Jesus taught from the law. He cleared up what the greatest commandment was from the law, and he got mad when traditions of his people in his own time actually contradicted the face value application of the law as he saw it. Yet the same Jesus also said a little bit later that verse 33, again, you heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. Okay, so let's break it down, because one of the things that said is that Jesus or the apostles taught against the law. So let's break that down. The book of Numbers gives commandments for how to take oaths. And Jesus said not to take oaths. Well, when you bring in this understanding from Simon the Just, it makes total sense. Why? Oaths were a choice in the Torah. Oaths were a voluntary thing that you could choose to do. So it was a voluntary, it was a commandment based on a voluntary choice. If you chose to take an oath, there were different rules for men than there were for women. So it's something you could choose to do, and then there are various rules if you decided to do it. But you could go your whole life without taking an oath in the Lord's name. What we see is that Jesus is not teaching against the law at all. Rather, he's saying, I don't want my followers to take oaths in the first place, which is a voluntary thing in the Torah because of how corrupt the practice was in his day. A very early instance of how Jesus is sending his followers, the so-called messianic community, apart from the world around them. So when we get a little bit later on and see how apostles like James reiterate the message and say not to take oaths, they're actually reiterating what Christ taught when he was here, and how what he's teaching is actually not against the law at all, but this voluntary thing that you could choose to do. He's saying, I don't want my followers to do because of how corrupt we see the practice is, and also because he's quoting scripture in his speech, is quoting the book of Isaiah. So the reason Jesus is saying not to take oaths is also from a perspective of a Jewish perspective on showing respect to God. So you have to put all this back in the context of ancient Judaism and see that he's not teaching against the law. On the contrary, from his own words, he upheld the law of his people. He upheld the covenant of his people. But when he looked at all these things, we're dealing with something that was a voluntary, conscious choice that you could choose to do. And if you chose to do it, here are the commandments. Jesus is saying, with regards to this voluntary choice, I do not want my followers to partake in. Let what you say be simply yes or no, and glorify God by means of that, by being a man and woman of your word. Even still, I believe that this is an example of virtue ethics and situational discernment. Why? Because Jesus was put under oath by the high priest and he responded to it. The Apostle Paul took oaths in certain instances. So even still, I don't think it's supposed to be an all-out ban on oaths in every situation, but a general ethic of conduct among Jesus' followers to set them apart in the world we live in, so that just your yes and your no acts alone. You don't need to swear on God's name to ensure the truth of what you're going to say. You're just saying what you're going to do it, and you do it. And you glorify God when you come through on your word, instead of taking his name to give a proof that what you're saying you're going to come through on. You see what I'm saying? And remember this. Remember how Jesus said that our righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees? They had man-made distinctions to decide which oaths were valid and which ones were invalid. So they basically had a system, the Pharisees, of how to weasel out of certain oaths based on subjective things. And Jesus was very frustrated at this. So when we look at the last part, when he said our righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, it makes perfect sense when you see how they were moving back in those days. Because they prioritized certain commandments and basically forgot about other ones and had man-made distinctions to sort of create loopholes within the practice of mitzvot. You feel what I'm saying? And within the practice of following God's commandments. He says this in Matthew 23. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold of the temple that has made the gold sacred? And you say, if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, he is bound by his oath. You blind men, for which is greater, the gift of the altar that makes the gift sacred, or the gift or the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears by it and him who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. So the Pharisees had a system where if you said, I swear by the temple, and you didn't fulfill what you said, you were Gucci, you were cool. Because after all, you needed to swear by the gold of the temple. And then you got to follow through on your word. But if you just swear by the temple itself, if you break the oath, the oath was kind of invalid. You didn't swear by, and Jesus is saying, that's ridiculous. Because what makes the gold sacred? That it's being used in God's house, or the fact that it's gold in God's house? Use some common sense. So this is so fire, because Jesus is basically showing the man-made distinctions they had to be able to invalidate certain oaths goes against the heart of the commandment. So from Jesus' perspective, when he lives in a culture where he sees the religious leaders moving in this way, he's setting his followers apart by saying, with regards to this thing that you are allowed to do in the Torah but not required, I don't want you to take oaths at all. Let your yes be yes and let your no be no. After all, our religious leaders are totally corrupt in regards to taking oaths. This passage in Matthew shows that corruption that was going on in those days. So to summarize, the Pharisees had man-made distinctions and wrong priorities that skewed their view of the law of Moses. And Jesus set out to reform these things. So when Christ comes in this culture where oaths are being abused, and he lays out a conduct where his followers are not to take them, it is totally reconcilable when it is the Torah, when in the Torah, taking an oath in the name of Yahweh was a totally voluntary thing in the first place. So when we can break down this conversation about oaths specifically, we can see how Christ and the apostles never taught against the law or taught against any of the commandments, but upheld it in deed and in principle. The only other facet to the conversation for our purposes is the belief of the early Christians in the new covenant that Yeshua had brought in by his death and resurrection. Here's where I want to tackle that too. This concept of a new covenant comes from the prophet Jeremiah, ancient prophet to Israel. God explicitly says that the new covenant will not be like the old covenant because the law will not be written on tablets of stone or something external to observe, but rather be written on our hearts. And it will be internal transformation to follow the precepts of the Most High. So while the belief is that we're under a new blood covenant, right, the blood of Christ for the remission of sins, and no longer under the old covenant, no individual mitzvah given under that time is ever taught against, either by Christ or the apostles, including Paul. So when we can get that basic framework, we can see how, when we look at the full nature of the Torah in its original context, this nuanced system with laws applying to different people within different functions of society, as well as moral laws that are all universally held on both sides of Moses, universally applicable on both sides of Moses. When we understand the covenant that was given to the Israelites, that was fulfilled and superseded by the new covenant promised by Jeremiah, we can reconcile the belief in the new covenant and the terms of the new covenant that God yokes our obedience, measures our obedience from, while also understanding that within the new covenant, no mitzvah in the Torah is ever taught against. So my prayer is that this can be a helpful source of unity within the global body of Christ, within various different traditions, ancient and modern, when it comes to the conversation of the law and how to relate to the law in our own lives, when it comes to either in principle or with regards to specific mitzvah we may be interested in exploring. When I say mitzvah, that's the Hebrew word for commandment, by the way. And I also pray it could be a blessing for all those inquiring about Yeshua as the Messiah. Because as we'll see, we can look at Deuteronomy 13, and it gives us qualifications for a prophet. Basically, if he comes claiming to be a prophet, but he goes against the Torah and the revelations of God, we have a means to disqualify him. But what we'll see with that standard is when we can come and actually understand ancient Judaism and understand what Jesus was saying and understand the Torah and look at even Simon the Just, bringing all these nuances, we can see from Christ's own words that he completely upheld the law and did it in practice. And the things he taught with regards to oaths and other things the apostles carried on are totally reconcilable with the fact that various commandments were based on voluntary choices that you could choose to do or not to do. So not only are we open the conversation to see his consistency with the Torah and the prophets, if you really want to study from a neutral perspective, but also see his ultimate vindication by the hand of the Torah and the prophets. When we actually begin to study everything within its original context and understand the things Christ was saying and the things spoken by the prophets that would need to happen, that would vindicate him as the one that was supposed to become and be sent to Israel, and for that matter, the whole world. So that being said, I wish grace and peace upon the global saints in exile, the global family of believers as we await our true home. Y'all be blessed, and I'll see you in the next video, all right? I pray this can be a blessing. Now that actually, might as well show it. I had a bunch of videos that are kind of like, sort of like free videos, apart from the playlist that I'm really working on. So now that I got basically all these singles done, I can start working on the playlists again. You see what I'm saying? So now I'm going to lock in back on the Messiah 2024 series, especially since now it's 2025. I wanted to finish this before the fall ended originally, but it's God's timing. So I'm going to lock back into studying prophecy to see how, from a neutral perspective, looking at things in the original context and looking at what it said, looking how it matches with Jesus' life and the way ancient Jews understood these things when possible, bringing all these things together, we can actually see how Jesus is vindicated as Israel's one and only Messiah. Next prophecy we're going to be looking at is Psalm 22. So y'all be blessed in the Messiah. I'll see you in the next one. If y'all need anything from me, let me know in the comments, all right? Shalom, y'all. Peace.